Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I wish I could be there. Anna is telling me about the exciting conference you're running, so probably next time. I want to share with you some of the stories on this field of birdsong, which you've heard from Anna on Monday. I've been working on this field for like 20 years on the problem of the physics of birdsong production, and as probably Anna told you already, birdsong or songbirds are a great animal model to understand the problem of learning of a vocal behavior. Of course, the interaction between physics and biology is very difficult. Any one of you who has participated in this interdisciplinary work knows. If we come from physics, we're used to trying to unveil basic mechanisms and performing simplifications. And if you work in biology, you are not rigorous unless you are framing everything in the evolutionary context. Therefore, simplifications are not very easily accepted. So when I started to work on this is a representation of the vocal organ that is used for phonations as drawn by a physicist on the left and a biologist to the right. And you can see that, for a physicist, you want to highlight what you think are basic elements, which are the variables and stuff. And if you're a biologist and you want to be rigorous, you want to make a precise description of every muscle that is going to be changed in the configuration of the vocal organ affecting the phonations. But basically the physics that is involved is that when air passes in between these labia are going to oscillate and they are going to modulate the airflow, and that's what's going to generate the sound. So when you change the configuration of the vocal organ, the frequency of those oscillations changes. This is the basic mechanism. So the program for a physicist is to write equations, and what I'm describing here are just the basic Newton's equations for the dynamics of the midpoint position of the labia. Okay, so you want to see when resound how these labia start to oscillate. And the way in which you describe that and you put this picture together is by performing a bifurcation analysis. That means studying for different parameters where the labia are going to oscillate. The interesting thing is that many of the acoustic features of birdsong are determined by the kind of bifurcation that originates the oscillation. So it's not the same sound what is going to be produced in a sudden node mid-cycle bifurcation or in the Hof bifurcation. So the idea behind doing this from a dynamical perspective is try to see how much is conditioned by the biomechanics and how much is learned through the complex neural network that Anna was describing on Monday. Dynamics carries the program one step further. It's even more radical. You don't want to concentrate on one particular physical model and the context, but you want to see which are the basic bifurcations that determine the set of dynamical behavior that are present. So in this case, we're performing a normal form around a codimension 2 bifurcation point, and you see that basically all the dynamical behavior is already captured by this very simple dynamical system. So this dynamical system is a cubic one, it's the normal form of a Takes-Bogdanov bifurcation. And the conjecture is that you can find very realistic simulations of birdsong with this normal form. So this basic idea that there is a simple mechanism behind that was what we've been exploring over the last 20 years with different experimental work, which I'm going to describe very briefly. But the idea is that with this, you have a universal description of at least 50% of the birds that exist. So there are like 10,000 species, half of them more or less are what are called docile birds, and those are the ones that learn to vocalize. They have all this neural architecture where Anna was measuring things on Monday, and they include, canaries, finches, thrashers, those that learn to vocalize. They have to be exposed to a tutor in order to acquire the vocalization. So part of our work is to test the idea that the universal model can account for the vocalization of half of the species. Part of the work is to work with these other species that don't learn, and they have to adapt anatomically in order to find their niche, their position in the acoustic landscape. So these models, we've been developing different strategies for building confidence on them. Some of them was directly to go and measure the activity of these tiny muscles in the seedings, the air sac pressure, and so on. But then we wanted to see whether these simulations with low-dimensional systems were realistic enough for birds. So this is the work we did with Anna many years ago, where we measured the activity of some neurons that are highly selective to the birdsong song. That means where the auditory and motor pathway meet in HVC, a nucleus in the telencephalon. There are neurons that when the bird is sleeping but listens to its own song, they're going to spike. So here you have the experiment where you have the sonogram, the acoustic representation of the song. You play the song to the bird, and you measure the neural activity of those neurons, and you have that the bird is sleeping, but the neurons are spiking. If you replace the song by synthetic models, what you get is a set of copies where if you change the parameters, you have sounds that are slightly different, and you see that if the model is good enough, and this is a good enough model, you can elicit responses. You can tune the parameters and find the optimal parameters so that the bird responds just like the birdsong song. And you have to fit this very well, because if you mess up the parameters, they rapidly change, and the bird doesn't respond to other finch-like songs, okay? So this was one of the first tests that the low-dimensional models were good representations that the bird could confuse that in their sleep, their own song. Then we did other tests, behavioral, like for example, training juveniles with songs that were deformations from the real ones generated by synthetic models, and the juveniles, if they were isolated, they would copy these songs. So they could take these synthetic sounds like models. But the challenge that I want to describe today is whether we could cheat wild birds and use those synthetic sounds in order to reinsert a song that is lost in the wild population. So what I'm describing here is a sparrow. It's called a cingolo sparrow, Zonotrichia capensis. So it's a bird that lives where I live. So I'm superimposing the sonogram, which is a spectral representation of the song. In the horizontal axis you have time, and the vertical axis you have the frequency. And this bird is a bird that learns only this one song, but it has to learn it from a tutor. So during the pandemic, we closed the lab. So what I was doing is following, which is the distribution of these sparrows in a natural reserve that is close to where I live. So these are the sonograms of these different songs. And as you can see, all these different songs are slightly different. All of them have a few syllables at the beginning. Those are called the themes. And then they have a trim. So the theme is different for every individual. Okay? They have to learn it from a tutor. And I was characterizing them and using some tools of artificial intelligence in order to classify these different songs. But then it occurred to me that in this very same natural reserve, 50 years ago, one of the great neuroscientists of our times, which is Fernando Nottebohm, has described the songs of the sparrows in this natural reserve. These are the 60s. You didn't have phones, of course. You didn't have even some digital recorders, unless you were in a very fancy project. They weren't, well, actually, there weren't digital recorders until the 70s, but he didn't have any tape recorders either. So what he did is he took sketches, okay, of the songs. So these are handmade sketches. And it's very interesting because he did publish this. In order to publish this, what he did is that then he went to Rockefeller, that is where he was working, and calibrated himself. He says, well, I'm going to make an estimation, and then I'm going to compare with a spectrogram. At that time, the spectrogram was computed with a special device. You would take a recording in magnetic tape and do some electronic filtering, and you would get a spectrogram with a special piece of hardware. You couldn't carry that around. So what he did is then he calibrated himself. And one thing that we decided to do is whether these songs that were learned 50 years ago are still sung today in the park. So this is kind of like a acoustic archaeology project. In order to do so, what we did is we generated synthetic sounds that had frequency modulations that were compatible with the handwritten notes taken by Fernando Nottebohm in the 60s. So we generated all these synthetic sounds that were following the frequency modulations that he described. And we generated similar synthetic sounds that are compatible with the present ones. So now we have a bunch of synthetic sounds, all of them synthetic, all of them free of noise, some of them following the frequency modulations of the present songs, and some of them following the prescriptions described by Nottebohm. And in order to see whether there were similarities, what we did is to build a SIMS network. So these are neural networks, two similar, identical actually, neural networks, which are trained in this way. The last layer defines a set of coordinates in an abstract representation space. Here I'm describing those coordinates as an Euclidean system of coordinates, and you train the parameters in such a way that if you have a similar input, similar image as an input, you will be mapping the points close, and if you input a different image, you're going to be mapping the points far away. So this is what happens if you request that the points are mapped to similar points if the images belong to the same class, and if they belong to a different class, you want these points to be mapped farther away. And when you do that training, this is what you get in two-dimensional projection of this latent space for the songs. The themes that are followed by a number are themes that are sung today in this natural reserve. And the themes whose names end with the letter are the ones that are our reconstruction of what Nottebohm described. And as you can see, there are three sets of songs that are still being sung. That means these are like the hits of the 60s, okay? They were very popular in the 60s. Actually, they were the more, they had the highest representation. There were many subjects singing those themes, and those themes are still sung today. Keep in mind that there is a learning process here. So birds are going to be learning a song if they learn it from a tutor. So if you have a song that is highly represented, it's very likely that there are going to be juveniles copying that song. And that song is going to be transmitted, and that is the reasons for which, even if there are fluctuations and the songs evolve and change within some boundary conditions that is determined by the neural architecture of the brain, some of the songs are still being kept. So with that in mind, we developed this little program that I'm going to describe briefly in order to finish this presentation. What we did is to build acoustic robots, which are capable of playing these synthetic songs in the field. So what we tested first is that the synthetic songs that was played by our robots could elicit similar responses in the territorial birds. If you put a sound, like the recording of a song, in the territory of one of these birds, it will be singing much, at a higher rate, because it gets very nervous that someone is going to compete for the females in its territory. So then what we did is selected a song that was present in the 60s, but is not found in present years. So we built an array of these robots that was playing this lost song, and we were hoping that some juvenile will take that as a tutor. So this is not trivial because, in principle, it's possible that they need also behavioral clues, right? Like to see that the male is handsome, skillful, or whatever, charismatic. And then our robots were also keeping the capability of recording what was happening acoustically in their neighborhood. So this is a typical song, okay, of one of these birds. And this is generated by the normal form of the Tokens-Bogdanov bifurcation when you modulate the parameters properly. Okay, enough of that. And this is what we did, playing for different models, like I think there were 12 different themes, real songs, synthetic songs, and heterospecific songs. So the birds are singing like 3 to 4 songs per minute, and suddenly for a couple of minutes, you will be playing in their territory a song. And the birds, they would start to lose, they would start to sing faster. Okay. Then when the recording stops, eventually they will recover their peace of mind and they will start to sing just 3 or 4 songs per minute. So as you can see, the real songs and the synthetic song are equivalent for the birds. But if you make the synthesis or the recording of a bird of another species, they couldn't care less, okay? They keep on singing. They're only concerned with what happens with vocalizations of their own species. It would make sense. So we took from our sketches by Noto a song that was not present. A song that was not present. And we generated this synthetic copy and we started to play it in the field. So we made this array of 3 devices that were unsynchronized and they were singing in a region. So within 50 meters of radius, we have these 3 boxes hidden in the trees and they were playing this synthetic song that corresponds to something that is eventually possible to reproduce for this species, but that has some acoustic characteristic that is not sung in the park anymore, in this natural reserve. So it's this second syllable that is a downstrip, this is not sung. Of all the birds that you can explore, this cannot be found. This is what happened on January 24th this year, which is the first time that we find these tiny, very subtle explorations of a juvenile, okay, that was trying to copy and sing together with the robot, okay? So here you see the first syllables with this feature that is not present in principle in any adult in the field, and this tiny bird was trying to imitate. A few days later, this song started to develop, and you can see here the model that is generated by the Tageslow-Sano bifurcation, and you have this little juvenile that is imitating the bird. So the alternation of upsweeps and downsweeps have not been found in the last 3 years, and the singing right by the box suggests that the juvenile probably learned that from the box. Okay, so we cannot rule out that it's found somewhere, and we didn't find a bird doing that. It's very unlikely. It's very likely that it happened by the robot. It is very interesting that some of the features are learned, like for example these modulations. But this feature, it's interesting because none of the birds that we ever recorded had this last syllable before the trill so small like in this sketch. So probably this sketch was a tiny mistake that may not do. So this very long syllable that is a downsweep, probably this is a restriction, a constraint of the neural architecture of the bird. And one of the fascinating things for us is to see how much of this can be learned and how much is conditioned by the neural network that decides which are going to be the motor gestures that are feeding our model. Here you have the model, the synthetic model that we used, that was slightly different from the actual songs that we reproduce consistent with Noto's notes, and here are the juveniles that are trying to match this model. And just to finish, I wanted to give you a flavor of the behavior. So this is a movie that I took just a couple of days ago. These days in Argentina are very exciting because we're in the winter, but at the end of the winter, when the birds perceive the winter is, starting to fade, and the juveniles are starting to choose who's going to be their model. And they will try their first vocalization. So what I'm showing you here is the response of a tiny juvenile that is responding to a hidden model, okay, and tries to match the song. So what I'm going to be showing you have to pay attention. The bird is around here, is here, okay, try to follow that. And at some point, I'm going to be putting, as if it was subtitles, the sonogram of what's happening. So these are the first tiny syllables that the bird will do. Now the robot will start. And after the robot starts, the birds tries to do their first attempts to be a thing. And it will get close to it and take advantage of the motivation that the tutor is providing, and will keep on practicing during the whole spring until it goes and finds a territory and try to seduce a female with the song that it produced. Of course, what I'm trying to do is to reinsert the song that is extinct, but we know that a few years ago it existed, so we know it's not a dangerous song that is going to lead to a bachelor. Okay, so there are some ethical questions that you have to take into account if you're going to reinsert something. But it's interesting because usually when you talk about biodiversity, you talk about the loss of genetic material, but when there is learning, there is also the loss of learned content. So what we're trying to see if whether robots can recover this culture eventually. So to summarize my presentation, we use the low-dimensional dynamical system to generate synthetic songs capable of tutoring wild birds. So we successfully inseminated the song, which had not been present in the region, at least for the last years. And the response of the breeding birds to the synthetic songs were indistinguishable from the response to conspecific songs. This is like our last behavioral test that these low-dimensional models are good enough. We have good hints by the neural work that we did with Anna, of course, but this is behaviorally, so we're very happy about that. So we think that minimal dynamical systems, minimal models, capture important empirical features. And this is interesting in order to have this conversation with the biologist. It is true that you have to frame everything in terms of evolution, but nevertheless, there is a hierarchy of importance of the elements. And sometimes when you can reduce your system to a minimal dynamical system, you can really focus on which are the parameters that are actually important. So in terms of our model, it is the tension of the labia that cause the restitution constant of the elastic material that are the labia, and the earth pressure that provides the energy. Okay, so it is conversation to know that a dynamical system can induce pertinent behavior is important in order to convey the idea that although the complexity of evolution, of course, you have to take it into account, you still set a hierarchy of importance, and you can have minimal models that help you capture what is important. So for us, having this tool opens from the point of view of ornithology, very interesting tools, because we can explore things like, for example, whether the skills necessary to widen the acoustic features is important, and so on. So we can introduce in the field a set of questions which are interesting. And one of the last aspects, which I think is very interesting, is that even if we have a copy, the copy is not exact, and whether these constraints inform us on the neural restrictions and conditions that cannot be learned is also an interesting question. And with that, I'm going to be finishing my presentation, and I will thank you for your kind attention. And I promise I will do my best to be there next time. Thank you very much. I cannot hear you.
Hello, yeah. Thank you for the wonderful talk, sir. I wanted to ask if different sound patterns correspond to distinct behaviors, and why in particular the 1960 song was selected for, in some sense. Did it correspond to certain distinct behaviors in, the birds that, yeah.
Right. Yeah. The reason I chose it is because it's the oldest record I could find for the songs in that region in particular. So these songs are like the typical songs that the birds are going to display during the spring. In terms of your first question, this is when they are trying to find their girlfriends. Okay, so they're going to be in the field doing their best to attract a female in order to to raise a family. Okay, so this is the typical song that you hear during the breeding season. The thing is that you don't have from back then, from 50 years ago, recordings for, unless for very specific places where some researcher had an actual tape recorder and was taking recordings. So the first recording, again, a digital recorder was produced only in 1973. Okay, before you had these tapes and just a few, so you don't have a wide sample of songs. So what you have, if you want to do archaeology of songs, are like these kind of sketches that people were taking, or musical representations of songs. So you have some examples from the 19th century where people tried to use musical notation in order to try to capture the modulations of the frequency. So in order to do this musical archaeology, you have to go to these cues. In this case, I have the privilege of that a very experienced ornithologist that had a very good musical ear, by the way, but because he was a musician as well, was taking these notes, and these are like the oldest notes. So the reason I took the one of the 60s is that because they were the oldest notes that I could find from songs of the region.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Gabo, does the bird just listen to the sound and copy it, or does it have to have a model sitting in front of it somewhere?
Well, that was a great, well, this is a very good question, because I was very fearful that I needed a model and that only the acoustic clue was not going to be enough. And actually there is a group in Germany, Constant Scharf, have been building a little model, and of course she was testing that in the lab, and she claimed that it was very important. And I was afraid she might be right, so I didn't have any indication that just to have the acoustic box was going to be enough in order to elicit the responses. So to me it was a surprise, a good one, that it was good enough. So what the juveniles do is they spend quite a while trying to find where the bird is hiding, but they get very excited about copying the song without the visual clues anyways.
Very nice talk. I had a question. So while transcribing the notes, the pattern of the bird singing, had they also noted down the bass frequency, or does it change over the years? How did you reproduce the same old sound?
You mean if they changed for the same animal over the years?
Yeah.
Okay.
He had only noted down the change of the frequency of the singing. So I was wondering, how did you get to that while reproducing the same sound?
Try me again, once more.
When noting down the frequency with only few lines, so did he also note down the start of one line, like maybe 300 hertz, like that? Did he note it down? Or how did you reproduce the exact same sound?
Oh, great! Very good point. So no, you're right. He would only do an estimation because he didn't have the possibility of finding exactly which is the starting frequency point and the final one. So what I did is a statistical analysis of all the upswipes, all the downswipes, and so on, and which is the range of the initial frequency of an upsweep, the end of a downsweep, and so on. And of course, since you have that for many individuals now, you have a very wide distribution. So what I have is, when I reproduce the sound and I didn't have the information of where it was, I use this wide distribution of initial values and final values. Therefore, there is a bias towards being more similar to what is being sung now. If there was a total shift over the 5 decades, I cannot capture that because he wouldn't have an actual estimation of the actual frequencies. So this is the way in which I estimated it, by doing some statistical analysis of what happens today. Right.
Thank you. Next.
Okay. Hi, Gabo. Very fascinating, as usually.
Hi, Theo. How are you? Nice to see you.
So I understand that 60 years in the life of this bird population must be like 1,000 years in human language evolution. So I understand that the language has changed a lot since their bird songs have changed a lot since 1966. But on the other hand, as these songs are learned and transmitted like that, and there is some plasticity. I can also imagine that a juvenile bird will be able to learn some song of a different species. I mean, birds are even able to imitate human language or even ringing telephones and so on. So, wouldn't it be possible to give it a song that was never used in this population, and that a juvenile would be able to learn?
Right. All of them good observations. First, as you say, in terms of the generations of the bird, these 60 years is a lot because these birds can live maybe a couple of years, only that. So to me, it was a surprise that even with the bias, going back to the question of the previous attendant, that there would be some songs that that could be recovered was a surprise to me. I would have imagined that there is a shift and so on. Whether that corresponds to the magics of learning or there is a strong conditioning by the neural network and the learning has fewer degrees of freedom that one wants to believe, I'm not sure. But what you say is also true, that when these birds have small populations, then there can be effects of the invasion of influences of another species, particularly when the evolution dispersion of species is very close, and you have species that are closely related, and there is some inbreeding that is cultural and not genetic. This is also true. And finally, the possibility of introducing something that was never sung is something that I'm designing right now. So what I want to do is to see whether I can inseminate a song that was never sung, that is compatible with what happens, and I want to study the cultural evolution of that invasion in the population. And that is something I'm designing right now. So, yeah.
Good.
Thank you. I have a short question. It's a naive question. Is there something like...
And you measure, of course, the success in terms of mating afterwards.
Right, exactly.
Whether your song was... This is what I was suggesting. You see, in Europe, we have this European song contest of I don't know how many countries competing for the best singers. And this would be a way to measure the success of your song.
Right. The Eurovision version of that. Yeah, I love it.
I have a small question. Is there something like a universal bird language? That means if you analyze the syllables, can you identify a language, and is that language, does it vary from locality to locality, or is there something universal about it?
Okay, so the first thing would be that although there is learning in the way they communicate, they don't have a syntactic assignation of symbols to a combination of syllables. So the question of language should be framed within that restriction, right? So they don't combine them in order to give meaning to that. Having said that, what is very interesting is that in these 10,000 species, you have a wide variety of varieties that you can find after the learning. So, for example, this species learns, but they will learn only one song. But once that it learned it, it will sing it until it dies. But there are other species, like canaries, that can sing, 10, 20 different songs combining, 30 syllables. And then you have other ones that have a very wide repertoire, like, starlings. So you have for different species, different variability of the songs that they can build. As far as we know, the only things that convey meaning are calls that are not learned. For example, they can use specific calls to warn that there is a predator coming. And there is a specific symbol for that. But usually those are not learned, those are genetically imprinted. The ones that are learned apparently are only conveying information of fitness for their territorial dispute or how good they are in order to seduce a female. And how they convey that information is one of these performance issues that I was describing at the end. I want to explore with these techniques. And it's an open question.
Okay. So thank you very much. I think for reasons of time, let's move on to the next talk. And thanks a lot, Professor Mindlin. Give him a big hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.